you very much. Make sure everything's on. Okay. Morning. It's been quite a while since I've taught a lecture. I moved into a research management position 2 years ago. And before that, for 20 years, I taught sociology, but specifically research methods. So when the library asked me, especially my faculty librarian, if I could assist in providing some general insights on data collection, I thought, yeah, it's a good idea to maybe polish up on my lecturing skills. Let's see if it works. I'm going to help you through 40 minutes of understanding what it is to collect data in the social sciences. It's almost like the history of the world in 10.5 chapters by one of my favorite authors. It's a huge and broad topic to cover in 40 minutes. I need to leave some time for questions, and I'd love to in any case. So let's just touch on the very basics today. That's what I'm hoping to do. Some basic options. Also trying to make you aware of the fact that there's more to social research than a questionnaire survey, because it seems like often people that are not used to social research training and that need to suddenly do social research think in that groove. And I would like to open up the possibilities to make you think a little bit broader than that specific data collection method. And here and there I want to give some guidelines, but it would probably be mostly in the format of comparing one method or technique with another. Again, you have to understand that I have to run through the topics and the comparisons, for instance, pretty fast, because we're not going to finish. So if you want to read anything further on the topics that I covered, my favorite methodology textbook of all time is Bryman. And Bryman, I think his 5th edition has come out already. It's just called Social Research Methods. And there's also a South African version of Earl Babby's book, which Johan Mouton and Earl Babby wrote together. It's a little bit dated now. It's 2000 and something, yes, about almost 15 years old now. So it's a teenager of a book at this stage. But in social research methods, very few things really change, except we've got new sources of data. Instead of talking about documents, we now have to think also about digital information, etc. But at the end of the day, not much has changed. I took out a textbook from 1986 that I was taught in this morning, because I remembered something very interesting in that textbook, and I realized how things have actually stayed the same. Johan Groenewald still wrote it. I don't know, some of you might know him. He's now retired, but he's still associated with the university, and he wrote a very good textbook as well. So let's quickly look at where we can position ourselves within the process of social research. Data collection is usually quite late in the process. It takes place, obviously, just before data analysis. And most textbooks, most authors, and most supervisors would tell you that it's quite important that you first do a literature review, at least a preliminary one, that you first develop your research questions, and clearly sampling also has to occur before data collection. There is a trend these days that in qualitative research, especially in highly unstructured, grounded theory qualitative research, to forego this completely and to start off with data collection. Tabula rasa, are moving to the field without knowing anything, without trying not to know anything, and I develop the concept and theories after data collection. Most of you are going to do a PhD or master's research. Not a good idea to do it this way around. It's radical, it's new, it's different. You could try, but most of the committees and the structures within which you will do your training for your PhD or master's will frown upon such a radical deviation from this very standard model. All right, so we have to ask ourselves, do I actually have to collect data? We live in a world where we have data everywhere. The time of big data, not just big science. It was big science a few decades ago. Now it's big data, even in the social sciences. We work with huge data sets that we need 2-3 servers to run. I'll talk about maybe some of my work a little bit later as well. So why do we keep on collecting more of the stuff if there's so much around? So I want to really bring the point home that secondary data analysis, also called secondary research, is something you always need to consider. Why shouldn't I analyze, for my own purposes, data that have been collected before by somebody else? There are some limitations, but there can also be huge rewards that I get from, for instance, analyzing the data that have been collected by someone else with their funds, their resources, and I get all of that. For instance, at the South African Data Archive, there are all kinds of data sets that one could download, that one could analyze. You can go also to Stats SA. There are a number of data sources there as well. Yes, mostly quantitative data though. In the United Kingdom, there is now a clearinghouse of qualitative data, but we in South Africa don't really have something to that effect yet. And the problems around research ethics with qualitative data also make us a little bit careful around sharing data. So the first point that I want to make is that it's not always necessary for you to collect your own data. So ask yourself that first, and then use the correct term. If I collect my own data, I'm busy with primary research or primary data collection, and then if I'm analyzing somebody else's research, somebody else's data that they've collected, it's secondary data analysis. And I find that students become a little bit confused here with, for instance, documentary analysis. If you look at as we do at CREST, if you look at a research article, or whole fields research articles that have been published in the last 10 years to see how productive the researchers in that field have been, is that primary research or secondary research? I'm looking at the output, the articles that have been produced, and I'm counting them, and I'm looking at who the authors are, the institutional affiliations. I'm gathering data, primary, I'm gathering data from the document. Whether I've gathered it from the individual or from a document, it's still primary data collection. It's only secondary if somebody else had done that gathering for me. If Stats SA took the census data and produced graphs and other statistics, and I use those statistics to do something new with it, where would that lead us in terms of this classification? There it's more difficult. It's a very grey area there. So you need to make sure that you think very clearly who collected the data. In this case, I would say, again, that would be primary research, because you are using Stats SA's analysis already. You're not using their data. You're using what they have done with the data as a product, and you're using that. So it would be primary research. Which brings us to the data sources that we can use. And this is especially important for opening up the options. And this is how we can think about what options we have out there. By dividing the main data, or dividing the data sources in the social sciences between historical sources and field sources. Field sources are the sources that we utilize when we either directly or indirectly observe individuals, normally in the social sciences, individuals. Direct observation is usually associated with ethnography, and what do we usually call it when you also become part of a group and do things with them, that group that you're studying or the people that you're studying? Participant observation. So that's in the form of direct observation. It can be without people's knowledge, which we try not to do in the social sciences. I've got two people here from the REC, probably checking whether I'm going to talk about how to collect data ethically, so I am making that point. Indirect observation is when you ask someone to report on their behavior. When does that happen, and why is that also colored in? This is the one that we normally think of when you think of social research. So just to show you what a small part it actually makes up. Indirect observation is therefore when I interview someone or when I give a questionnaire to someone to fill in. Self-administered questionnaire or use of an interview schedule in an interview, which then can differ in structure. But we've got all these other sources as well that we can use. Documentary sources and physical sources. Now, documentary sources, as I said, have changed in nature from 1986. These days, we can look at documents on the internet. We can look at Facebook posts if it's available in the general public, to the general public. The examples that I can use from my work is where we look at Thomson Reuters Web of Science, for instance. And it is to a certain extent secondary data analysis because we get from Thomson Reuters the data on the publications of all the articles, well, the publications, that's the articles and some of the other document sources that are indexed in the Web of Science. But we just get the data and then we start analyzing those data. These days we can see even who's funding research by an analysis of the acknowledgement sections, which now is also collected by Thomson Reuters. I think it's now changed as well from Thomson Reuters to another company, but just so that we all are still on the same page, I think at this stage it's okay to call it Thomson Reuters Web of Science. But Thomson Reuters in that regard then is using documentary sources, the articles that scientists produce as the sources of data. From that they pull out, as I mentioned, the address to know with which center or university a researcher is affiliated, the country. We can look at a lot of parts of an article to find out things about science and its production. Can you think of any other document sources or documentary sources, except for Facebook, Twitter? What else can we use that people create every day? Blogs, there we go, which are a form of diary, so diaries are also quite useful. So, physical sources, now this is interesting, and very few people actually use these. There are two types, accretion and erosion. There have been studies done that illustrate both. Accretion means something that that human beings have physically added to the social or natural world that we then study to understand social behavior. For instance, tombstones can be considered an accretion. Graffiti, although some people would say it can be a documentary source depending how extensive the graffiti is. But trash, people's trash, something we add. Anybody else with any ideas on how we can be more creative in trying to understand people by not talking directly to them or watching them directly? Fashion, there we go, that might be a good, yes, that is a very good example. And it's actually the example of that by Ronald Dupree at Economies en Bestuurswetenskappe. She did it for a PhD. Yes?
Something like art, painting.
Absolutely. Art, paintings. And then we call those artifacts as well. Artifacts. All right. If I follow Earl Babby. Why would we consider these? Because you get the feeling that you're sort of one step removed from what you really want to study. But why would you like to be one step removed? To lower your reactivity. The ultimate aim of social research is to get to a valid, reliable representation of what is going on in the social world. And the moment we study people, as opposed to studying plants, rocks, I always feel so jealous of the geologists, we get that reaction. And we change what we are trying to study, just by studying it. Giddens is double hermeneutic, if some of you are interested in the philosophy behind that. So the more removed I am from that which I'm studying, the less reactive my method is. So if I'm studying scientists via their publications, which is what I do, then they don't even know that they're being studied. And they've produced their papers and put it in the public domain for me to look at. So I don't even have to ask their permission to use these documents as sources of data. So I don't get any reactivity. But what is my problem here in terms of control? Because what I'm trying to show with this, this arrow is that there's a positive relationship between reactivity and control. The higher the level of reactivity, the more control I have, and vice versa. So if I am studying using documents as sources of data and not at all dealing with the scientists themselves, I lower my reactivity to zero, but I have very little control. What I mean by that is the scientists produce their articles without me being involved at all. So the data were produced in a certain sense without my say-so and without me having any say in how it's produced. So in other words, we can't really choose what we can get from an article. We know we can get certain bits and bytes of data, and that's it. It stops there. We can't get anything more. I can't, for instance, get necessarily the gender of a researcher unless, luckily recently this has started happening, the editors put the first name of a person on the paper. Now I can do gender analysis. But before that, when it was really just the initials and the surname, and in some journals it's still like that, you cannot do gender analysis. So you have no control over that. That is just the limitation of this data source you're using. But if I do direct observation, I go sit in a laboratory, I can clearly see who is male and who is female. Give and take some of the recent developments now in transgender, etc. But one can normally also ask people with indirect observation what they identify as, and then do direct or indirect observation of their research. So you're not limited there. You've got a lot more scope. And you've got a lot more control. But the reactivity clearly is much higher. As anybody who's ever tried to study scientists in a laboratory would know, they act very, very differently. And then also one must realize that a document is not produced necessarily for your research. It's produced for another reason. And a paper, for instance, a research paper can be produced for, or with the idea of sort of rhetorically arguing for a certain point. And if I want to do a content analysis, I must take that into account. That this is not necessarily a reflection of exactly what happened in the lab or in the field. A research paper is not an exact replication of research that has happened. So although we say we study the research system in South Africa and how researchers do their research, so we can only do so within the limitations of the paper and what it represents, and it's a rhetorical device. All right, so sorry I'm using so much of the scientometrics, which is what I'm referring to here, scientometrics research methods, but it's a very interesting, I think, example of how one can use artifacts as sources of data, and then how the reactivity comes in later on when one decides to rather move towards the individuals. All right. Now the next question to ask is quantitative or qualitative data. My experience is that these days qualitative data analysis is what most students end up doing, collection analysis. But it depends. Some faculties where students are doing social research tend to still sort of gravitate towards the more quantitative side of things. But we need to start understanding how that choice should be made and what really informs that choice. And it involves asking yourself how you see social reality. And you don't realize it, but if you're in the agri-sciences, for instance, because I work quite often in the agri-sciences supervising students with Professor Karen Esler and some of her colleagues, if you're in the agri-sciences, you've been socialized to see the world and the social world in a certain way, very much like you see the natural world, relatively unproblematic and a reality that exists out there. And the best method to study it is probably the experiment, and then you go down from there until you hit rock bottom when you do uncontrolled kind of observation of people. Now, what I've referred to here is basically ontology and epistemology. Look at epistemology. What do you think is good data? That's actually bad grammar in academia. It's data are plural. What do you think are good data? What is quality? And here, if you say quality is to really understand in depth, without necessarily generalizing to a wider population, then you might be happier with qualitative data. Otherwise, you're going to feel highly frustrated. If you say, I want to make really important general statements that policymakers can use, I want to describe broadly so that we've got a really wide field of scope. We understand poverty, for instance, by comparing individuals in South Africa according to certain independent variables on poverty as a dependent variable. Then you are obviously going to go for quantitative data collection because you're going to struggle to do that with qualitative data. So you need to understand what you yourself, through your socialization in your field, have come to understand what is acceptable knowledge. This is quite interesting because, I mean, I've worked in between the sociology and natural sciences disciplines, and it's very, very interesting to see how different these kind of levels of acceptance are. We sociologists consider it these days quite passé to do a survey. It's definitely not a good idea to present that as a research proposal. There always has to be a much deeper understanding and a design that will allow that understanding. While, as I said, in the natural sciences, very rarely would you get a phenomenological study or an ethnography. You find perception studies there with statistics, etc. All right, so find out what your supervisor as well and your colleagues consider to be good research, or be ready for a good fight. And you also need to understand how you see the world, because if you see the world as something that is relatively stable and it exists without us having to observe it, independent of us as observers, which is the kind of idea that most of us walk around with, then you need to consider quantitative data collection, unless you want to challenge yourself on a very deep philosophical level. If you've had training, as Cassie, for instance, there at the back has had, in anthropology, where you get taught rigorously how to be very open to relativity of cultures and behavior, and how things change over time and across spaces, geographically, spaces of mind. In other words, that each individual's own perception of the reality is unique and cannot really be generalized, then you'll be very happy with qualitative data. So I'm giving you extremes, and I'm a bit of a caricature kind of illustration of different ontologies. But it's really necessary before you start collecting data to start thinking about how you see reality. Do you see an institutional culture of Stellenbosch University to be created every day by the way that we say things to each other and by the way that we act? Or do you believe that institutional culture is embedded in the policies that have already been written, and there it is, and I can find it, I can measure it, I can identify it, and I can describe it, but just reading the policies and having an interview with the rector? Which one are you? If the former, qualitative data, the latter, quantitative data. All right. As I've explained, you have these choices. You also have mixed methods. Yes, you can try to do both. As you can see, you're going to have to do some philosophical, what is it, line dancing or something, because you're going to have to jump from one ontology to another if you want to do mixed methods. It's possible, but you need to be able to manage both. When would you also decide to do qualitative research? When it makes sense to do it in a natural setting. It's important that you see things through the eyes of the people being studied. These are the differences between the two. So if you are really in the mood for an instrument, a research instrument, which is a questionnaire or an interview schedule, if you feel that this is the way you want to collect data, you are already pushing yourself towards a certain method and also a certain epistemology and ontology, so watch out. Watch out in the words that you use, the terms. If you use the term a research instrument and you're doing an ethnography, it grates, it's not correct. That term of instrument, where does it come from? The natural sciences, where people use instruments in laboratories to measure things. The moment you start taking an epistemology on board that is much more towards the social constructionism side of things, then you don't want to measure people. So you don't want to use the word instrument, the term. You have to sort of own this whole epistemology in the language that you use and in the way that you collect data as well. All right, I'm not going to say much about this, although it has the ethics part in it. I just want to see where I'm now. 15 minutes still. Okay, not too bad. 10 minutes. Kan ek maar aangaan? Okay, so as I said, research questions, reasonably well, need to be defined, and that's the most difficult part. Data collection itself is really not that difficult, although Cassie is coming to see me tomorrow about some quandary, as she said. Sorry, I'm referring to a student of mine that I taught last year. There are some quandaries in the field that happen every now and then, and but really the most difficult part of research is to get those research questions right. Now, there's a huge difference between a research question and a question that you ask a respondent or participant. Again, the terminology is important here. Respondent, much more towards the quantitative side of research. A participant, I'm participating with you in creating knowledge. Much more in the qualitative paradigm. What you then have to do is, now I completely confused myself and I can't remember where I was. Okay, so you have to identify your research questions reasonably clearly. If you're in the qualitative paradigm, it's not that important that you do it that clearly. You want to have some openness, some flexibility. A pilot study is always a good idea. Think ahead of access, institutional permission, which is also handled by the ethics committee, although it's not an ethics issue per se, but it's very much related to ethics. I always think it's access, and then you've got ethics. Ethics, for me, is something that it comes up when I start interacting with the respondent or participant. All right. So when I start interacting with the respondent or participant, direct observation or indirect observation, I need to first think about voluntary participation of that respondent/participant, no harm to that person. Subjects, I use the term subjects there, I copied and pasted from a previous old slide. This comes from Earl Babby and Maton. The term subjects is frowned upon these days. As I said, rather use respondent, especially in the case of surveys, or otherwise use participant. Subjects really only for those of us who still do old-fashioned, but who still do experiments with people. And I've seen that, except for field experiments, but laboratory experiments have really gone down quite a lot. I mean, they're not used that often anymore. But in that case, you are very welcome to use subjects. Anonymity, confidentiality, and do not deceive subjects. We did say direct observation is highly reactive. So some people say, oh, I can get the pluses of direct observation in that I get high level of control of what I can observe. And then I can lower my reactivity by just not letting people know that I'm observing them. So it's a win-win. But then there's always a problem with ethics. Now, in participant observation, it is sometimes allowed, Marlene, I'm looking at you here as well, it's sometimes allowed in some ethnographies to observe people without asking their permission. We have an example of somebody who just wants to see how students react during the fees must fall rights or protests. So the student will go out during the protests and just observe. Now, going around with an informed consent form or even saying, hey, can I quickly watch you while you're protesting, clearly is not going to work. And I think there one can make a good case saying, well, this is something that's happening in a social setting that is a public setting where people can, where people generally have to assume that they are being observed by others, whether for the purpose of research or not. Clearly, if you're taking pictures of this or observing people whose names you catch, anonymity and confidentiality still apply. So you need to still take the photo, the photos need to be photoshopped in a way that you don't identify them, etc., etc. But as you can see, there are ways in which you can get a win-win with reactivity being high and reactivity being low and high control as well. In social surveys, let's see how complicated it can become. I mentioned right at the beginning that you have two data collection methods. That's true, and it basically depends on whether you are involved in the filling in of this form or not. And it's called an interview schedule when I'm doing a structured interview, or a self-completion or self-administered questionnaire if the person is literate enough and you don't think they're going to have problems filling in the questionnaire. If I want to have a structured interview, for a survey it has to be structured. It can be semi-structured, but you're going to give yourself a lot of work with coding afterwards. You can choose to have a face-to-face or a telephone interview. This is strangely from Bryman, and I think one can put Skype in here, but I guess that's what telephone refers to. But just take into account that there isn't really a difference between the two. Sometimes people say really being face-to-face with somebody in the office, for instance, having an interview is better than doing it over the phone. You can't see if they're pulling a face over the phone, but I don't think that adds that much to data. If you have a lot of people around the country you need to interview, do it via telephone. And then in each case you can do it with computer-assisted methods, face-to-face, computer-assisted interviewing, personal interviewing, or CAPI, where there's software that you have these days on tablets. I don't know if any of you have been on the receiving end or maybe on the giving end of one of these surveys. And then self-completion questionnaires, supervised, that's sort of in between, that's why it's positioned there, in between the self-completion and the structured interview. Because it's basically where you say, okay, here's the form, but I'll sit here, and in case you have any questions, you can ask me. Or I drop it off and I come and pick it up again, which is a form of supervised self-completion. Because as I pick it up, I say, did you have any problems with section X, Y, or Z? Postal, these days, I don't think anybody will ever consider snail mail. You never know. It might be that somewhere, they don't have internet. But these days, email or the internet is the way to go, and we can do a lot, much more than we could in the past in terms of the numbers that we can send out. These questionnaires too. Sometimes you have it as an email where you can embed a questionnaire in the email. Alison, who's sitting there at the back, and I are doing a research project trying to understand something small. We just want to ask 2 questions of authors of articles. And I said to her, we're going to do the embedded one, where it's basically an email message that says, could you just answer these 2 questions for me? If you have something a little bit more extensive that you want to ask, and you've got a real sort of 3 or 4 pager, attach it. That's problematic. The person has to print it or fill it in on that form and jumps out. I don't know. It's problematic. Best thing is to use the web survey. The web survey is where your questionnaire appears when the person clicks on a link, and you can talk to people at IT about your software options in that regard. The university has got software as well as, there's SurveyMonkey and all of those that we've all used in the past as well. So that's probably the best one. And what I argued the other day is that very few people actually have samples these days. They don't draw samples anymore because it's become so easy with this kind of method to reach the whole population that you don't actually have to sample. So watch out when you start using that term sample. What my sample is, if I've defined a certain population by drawing a border around it with words to find it, I say, for instance, African scientists, we've just finished this project, and this is exactly what happened. We had a huge argument about this, which I won, but anyway. So we've got African scientists we define as scientists who live currently in Africa, have an African nationality, and have published at least 1 article that's been indexed in Web of Science in the last 3 years before data collection. So very nicely operationalized, that's my population. All right, and we sent it to everybody that we could find that fit those criteria. We cannot use the word sample then. Whoever responded back selected themselves for the study. I didn't select anybody. And afterwards, if I decide, you know what, I got a number of people here, I don't know why, but they don't actually have an African nationality, I'm going to cut them out. It's just you cleaning the data. It's not sampling either. So one has to just watch out how one uses these terms sometimes. South African data collection often requires interviews because of people's lack of functional literacy to be able to deal with this very Western instrument called a survey questionnaire. Just the idea of a scale is sometimes not within the grasp of some people. When one has complicated issues one wants to deal with, an interview is probably a little bit better. And you can also make important observations. You don't have to ask someone certain issues. You can just see what's going on. You come up to a house and you can say, okay, this is a brick structure, so you tick that off. You don't have to ask the person, do you live in a brick structure? You understand? All right. So, qualitative interviewing, probably the most widely employed method these days in qualitative research. So it's the sort of counter to the survey. How does it differ from the structured interview? Well, there are some differences there. I love this one about rambling. You want somebody to ramble when you're doing a qualitative interview. Please depart from the schedule. Listen to the person. Respond to what the person's saying, not to what your interview schedule is telling you to ask. Here, in a structured interview, you should get nervous when somebody starts talking about something that's completely, according to you, completely irrelevant to the topic. Okay, completely irrelevant, I suppose, rambling should also be stopped at a certain point in the qualitative interview, but you have to be very careful before you do so. Here, you are the one who decides what's important or not. In a qualitative interview, you need to stand one step removed from what is important. You need to let the participant decide what that is. Obviously, the approach should be much less structured, which means you've got much less to do before data collection, because you need to draft, say, for instance, 1 page with a few open-ended questions and maybe lines underneath them. You can have one question. That's the most unstructured kind of interview. If you want to think in terms of a scale from most extreme unstructured, you would have a single question, tell me about your life. The life history, there we go, and I write down, or I record digitally. So if I yeah, at the REC, we're actually quite happy sometimes if people have unstructured interview schedules, because we don't have to go through every single question of the questionnaire to see if, you know, it's relevant to the research questions, whether it's sensitive, etc., etc. Your problem is at the end is, you never know whether you're going to have an ethically important moment where somebody starts rambling about very sensitive stuff, and suddenly you realize that a woman's child is being molested. Now what do you do? So ethically, it looks very easy for us. We look at the very short interview schedule, but ethically it can be very, very difficult in the field itself because you don't know what's going to come out. So you've got a very basic topic that nobody thinks is ethically sensitive, and then at the end of the day it becomes a very problematic moment when you have the interview itself. All right, so what else can we say? Focus groups. There's been a very strong movement towards focus groups that I've been picking up in, when I'm on committees and I look at proposals. I look probably at 3 or 4 a week. And it's very interesting to me that people go for focus groups, because they've got so many limitations. I didn't even put the advantages up because I can't find a single advantage, except for the one that most people do not use focus groups for, which is to see how people construct reality in a group, to see how they interact with each other and eventually come up with a common understanding of something. Most people think a focus group is a cheaper way of doing 8 to 10 individual interviews. One go, chop chop, forby. It doesn't work like that. Think ahead on how difficult it is to transcribe a focus group. People talk at the same time. You can't hear what people have been saying. Has anybody here tried focus groups? And am I being too negative? Yes?
I did a digital focus group website, and you story about
Oh, that's a very good point. I'm old-fashioned here. I'm thinking about a round table with people around it. Digital focus group. Okay, that can work. That can counter some of these issues. But at the end of the day, please, the unwanted group effects of people feeling that they don't have the power to answer or talk, that they should sit back and, self-esteem issues, social hierarchies. It's a minefield of problems. Personal interviews, and ethical problems as well. Because if something sensitive gets raised in a focus group, now you have to get everybody in that focus group, actually before the focus group, you have to get everybody to sign a confidentiality agreement. And people don't keep to that. The moment they're out of that door, they start blabbing about what happened. That's how people are. Maybe I should be nicer to people this morning. All right. And on that note, I think I've just gone over 45 minutes. Yes?
Just on focus groups, for one to be very careful. I think it will also depend on the topic. If you know that you are not going to touch on sensitive.
Yes, I mean, if you want to know, not to be facetious, but if you want to know why people like a certain brand of toothpaste, you know that this is not going to lead to sensitive issues about children's cavities and who's to blame, the two parents, and, but it could. But yes, it's the topic. It's definitely the topic. Sensitive issues, what did we have? We had an example of children who burned down schools. And the question then was, okay, or the suggestion was that everybody sit around the table and discuss this thing that happened, these acts of violence. At the end of the day, I said it makes sense to do a focus group there, because there was really this need to get people to talk together about something that they themselves experienced as negative. And some people didn't. Some people think it's a good thing. So you see, there we have this whole idea of the creation of a reality during the focus group, which is what your main focus should be. So it's fully within the qualitative paradigm, within the epistemology of social constructionism. You can't do a focus group and say you're doing a quantitative project, because it just it clashes with the ontology and epistemology. Sorry, yes. We're already in question time.
Yes.
So you're going to field the questions.
Yes, everybody else, yes. I have two questions. My first one is, in terms of the difference between structured and self-completion interviews, where does GPS tracking of individuals fall into? If you track the movement of people.
If you
And
track
then the second one, I'd just like to know your opinion on giving individuals incentives to complete a certain questionnaire or competition to gain the data from that. So we see a lot of these web questionnaires that says if you fill this in, you can win a prize or something like that. Just your opinion on that specific example.
Okay, the first question, I don't have a pen, so I'm just going to answer one by one. The first question, to answer that, you won't be able to classify it as either one of an interview or a self-administered questionnaire. It is not indirect observation, but direct observation, the GPS, I would argue. So therefore, that doesn't fit into the indirect observation classification system. And secondly, one can sometimes argue that it's ethical to provide an incentive, but it depends on the incentive. A monetary incentive is usually not considered as good as something else. And the context is important. If you have an area that is known for high level of alcoholism, you're not going to offer them necessarily cash or a voucher to go to the bottle store. I mean, you're adding to problems of people's lives sometimes if you incentivize in a certain way. It's a bit of a crude, example, but we actually had that once. Not that it was a bottle store, but we had to think about what are people going to do with this money? How are we going to make sure this money actually reaches whoever is at most at need? So what we'd rather like to see is a token of thanks, a token of gratitude that the person has given time and effort. And definitely you have to include remuneration for any costs incurred. So if a person has to drive to a certain place to meet you and the other focus group participants, then you obviously need to pay them for that. You need to compensate for time. You need to compensate a farm worker. If you take that farm worker out of the factory, 20 years ago we needed to think about that into our budget. We need to take them out of the factory. They're on stukwerk, it's called, piecework. So, after 3.5-hour interview, we had a very long interview that we had to have. 3.5-hour interview, that person has lost X amount of money, unless you made an agreement with a farmer, but you have to compensate. All right, so at the end of the day, dangling thousands of rands cash in front of a participant's nose is not a good idea, because on a philosophical level, it also counteracts voluntary participation. The person gets overly incentivized by monetary value rather than really considering the pros and the cons for themselves of participating in the project, which is what you want to do. You actually don't want outside influences ever to make that voluntary participation less voluntary.
The next question, please. You mentioned accretion and erosion as two types.
Oh, and I never went into erosion.
You could go to erosion as examples, and I just would like to know what examples.
If you want to see which exhibits at a museum attract the most people, instead of afterwards at the door standing there and saying, did you look at this museum exhibit? You look at the tiles and how they get eroded. you need over a long time, you need to do this kind of research. And I think other things as well, where things just get rusted or taken away, where rusted is more like, okay, that's not people involved, but if people break down things, break down buildings, you can also study that. But it's definitely much more a historical and over a long period of time that you can do this. But the one about the tiles was done. It was done in New York, actually. So So erosion is not, it's just for interest's sake to consider it. But thanks so much for reminding me.
You had a question?
Yeah, I just want to also your opinion on the indigenous research methodology, which counteracts the qualitative and quantitative, which looks more Western in the process of decolonization, where you need to give the voice and the name of the participants who may not have a chance to have their name published against their opinion. I thought I would get something in your presentation.
On data collection. So I'm still very much in an old-fashioned paradigm, I think, where I follow data collection from quite a Western perspective. Although I did my master's on participatory action research. And so I'm very aware of the political, and I'm also a feminist researcher, so I'm very aware of politics within science and politics within data collection. But I've been very disappointed in the way in which non-mainstream research, such as those types of research, have been disregarded by the scientific community. So there's still a hegemony of what is considered to be good data collection. Even within Western paradigms of data collection, we've got an assumption that quantitative data collection is per se something that you should do. If you deviate from that, you do qualitative research and then you have to justify your decision. So you'll always find that people justify why they do qualitative research, but they don't really justify why they do quantitative research. It's changing slowly, but it shows you what's going on in the background. Now, sorry, I'm slipping off into another direction, but I'm trying to make a general point here. And that is that you're fighting a way of thinking that's been entrenched for a very long time. How to change it is to make practices more common, and that is by teaching people the various options. Yeah, I didn't go as far as to teach participatory action research, but I did say that you create knowledge together with people in that paradigm. So hopefully we can move, maybe at another session, into much more detail on that specific issue. But sorry, that's as far as I could have gotten with it.
Do we have any other questions? No?
Yes?
I was just wondering, at what point do you need ethical clearance in your research? For instance, you know you need it if you're going to interview 20 people and include and tape them or record them.
Mm-hmm.
Not exactly the right phrase
We still use that. I don't
Anyway, my age.
I'm sorry.
Record them.
Yeah.
And use direct quotes from them. Then I understand you needed them. But say, for instance, you want to get up from your desk, walk to the office of the scientist next to you, and ask them a question, and it's one person, and include their quote within your literature study, say, for instance, or somewhere. Does that need ethical clearance?
No.
For one person impromptu?
No, one has to distinguish between empirical data collection and say, for instance, now literature review. Now, why would you directly quote a colleague, though? You would rather quote that colleague's work, which is actually a quote of the colleague. But let's say you decide to quote the colleague directly. If the colleague is happy to be quoted as such, and the name of that person can be given, it is then called not an interview. It is not an interview, but you can correct me, but that's not something you need ethical clearance for. I get this from Bryman as well, where he distinguishes between a key informant, and it's somebody that is very well known to the reader of an ethnography, for instance. That person is not hidden and is not that much a source of data, but somebody who clarifies things every now and then. And then you have your data collection. All right. But what I'm finding here is maybe a concern that ethics clearance takes away the ability to be spontaneous when it comes to data collection, to respond to an opportunity that arises suddenly to collect data. I'm interested, for instance, in protests. I cannot predict when the next protest is going to happen on campus. I cannot. So I cannot ask the REC for permission. The moment it happens, I have to run out of my office with my recording equipment, and I don't know, what would I do, Marlene?
Well, if you know that you want to start a protest, then you can say to the committee, this is what I want to do. I don't know when I'm going to do it, but I want to do it.
Okay.
But if it's something happening in the public domain and you've recorded it, then it's a piece of data that you want to analyze. And so then you can tell the committee I have this recording that I got I mounted myself or I got from the university cameras that's recorded. And I want to analyze this piece of data. Then it would be okay to answer afterwards. I want to analyze this.
Yeah, and then we look at, but you know, the point here is also that you've got something called data, and you've got something called sort of literature that you just review, and in the latter case, you don't need to ask the REC for ethical clearance. But if you want to include a quote in a literature review, you're mixing the two up, so now it's confusing and it's difficult to answer.
Yeah, I'm thinking specifically in if you, as part of your course module, you have to write essays, like a Chris.
Yes.
So if I have to write an essay on a specific topic, and I then ask 3 scientists just that are my colleagues that work with me in the same building, I walk to them and I say, what do you do in this case? Or what do you do in this case? Or I send them a quick email with a question, and they send me an answer, and I then include it in an essay. It's not part of my study. It's not going into my thesis.
Okay.
Do I need, and
No.
I don't put their name, I just say researcher 1 or researcher 2.
In this case, yeah, you're bringing up another level of complexity, but it's good. There's a difference between research and training, and some training involves having to do some type of research, but we don't expect in those cases where it's only for training purposes, only for writing that essay, which you're not going to publish, which you're not going to go to a conference with. It's only for an assessor to assess, your supervisor or your lecturer. Then no REC clearance is necessary, or desk clearance, because it's for training purposes.
Any other
I
questions?
think we need to have an ethics workshop as well.
We actually, no, we don't have an ethics workshop. We have a copyright one that looks at some ethical
Ethics, okay.
consideration.
No, that's
But
interesting.
not, yeah. Any other questions? No, well then I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, Dr. Prozesky. We enjoyed it. I learned a lot more about quantitative and qualitative, which method I should possibly look at. Remember that these recordings will be on the library website, and we would like to say thank you so much for your
Oh, thank you. Thank you
attendance.
very much. Thank you for asking me.